everyone. So if there's anything in our top 10 list of features that people wanted worked on, it's the terrain tools. It's been long requested. And so I just want to cover the last year of updates, what we've been working on, some of the new features, and then do a little bit of a demo at the end to show them off. So let's go through this. So like I said, Unity terrain has been something that's been requested to have updates for quite a while, and in 2018 we started to do that. We hired some people, got a terrain team together, and in 2018.3 that was our first big update for terrain. Some of the main features that we brought in was GPU instancing. So rather than having each tile having its own mesh, we're going to have one mesh and instance it and just pass in the height data, and that just led to better rendering performance and also better loading time as well. As well as an API for making your own brushes and better normal map support as well. So the multiple terrain support was really important. If we're going to have a large streaming world, then we want to have lots of terrain tiles, not just one big terrain that we render all of that all the time. So we had multiple terrain support. You could easily paint over multiple terrains, create terrains and extend your terrain, create tiles and extend your terrain, and lots of new brushes and layers as well. And we brought in this API to let you make your own terrain tool. So this really opened it up for people to extend the tool. So there's an example here of how you could create your own brush, for instance, and alter the height map directly. And some of the kind of adjacent features that weren't necessarily terrain features, but one thing here is the new shortcuts manager. When you're working with terrain, there's a lot of different modes. You want to switch to your paint tool, you want to change the size of your brush, you want to rotate something. It's really tedious to have to do that using your mouse or the interface. So it's nice to have shortcut keys that you can remap to exactly how you'd like to use the tool as well. And the terrain tool became a package as well in 2019. So this just means that the terrain team can update more regularly. We get terrain updates without having to wait for a next major iteration of the Unity editor to roll out. And so here are some other improvements from 2019.1. The brush settings were now per brush. It used to be that when you change the brush strength or size, that applied to every brush, and so you were constantly kind of adjusting and tweaking those. So now when you have a brush, you just see, here's the size, here's the strength, here's the parameters I want to use for that particular brush, and it hangs around, and you can then switch to a different brush and have your own parameters for that. More sculpting brushes. So here we see the mesh stamp and some erosion tools, and the terrain toolbox. So one thing you'll find is when you start working with multiple terrain tiles, there's some management issues that you have. If I've set up some brushes on one terrain tile and I switch to a different tile, then I don't actually have the same setup. So we have a toolbox here for creating terrain, editing, working with this multiple terrain setup that we have. So this is the common brush control. So again, per brush, some new settings here for rotation, spacing, strength, and size. And here we go. Here's a demo of the hotkeys. So as we're placing this mesh stamp here, I can easily just click and drag and adjust the size, the direction, the strength of the brush, so not always clicking back to the editor to draw sliders and then seeing if that's the effect I want. I'm going to preview in the editor. I can see exactly what I'm going to be stamping down before I do it, and have a shortcut key there to edit. And a whole bunch of new brushes as well. So people often relied on third parties for this, like Gaia or World Creator. So some of the brushes now you can bring in here, like mesh stamping, setting the height. And I'll show you a demo on this later on, but I love the set height because you can sample a height in your terrain, and then you can use the brush to just lower everything or bring everything up to that height. So when you want to place a building on a plateau or a hillside in your game, this is the perfect tool. You can just use this brush to just kind of bring everything in that area to the same height without having to fiddle around with raising and lowering and trying to tweak your terrain to have a plateau there. So let's have a look at some of these in more detail. So here's the mesh stamp. So I can take any mesh and stamp it onto the terrain. and are really useful for, say, a cliff face or something like that, where you have an artist-created asset that you'd like to use as part of your terrain, where you can just stamp it on there. Smoothing and cloning. So this is awesome. You can select part of your terrain and clone it. So you've spent a lot of time getting one cliff face, one mountain just right, where you can now reuse that around other areas of your terrain. And smudge, pinch, and twist as well. So new brushes and modifiers, and it shows some of this API that lets you extend the terrain, what you can do with it as well. You can make tools like this that suit your purposes. I really like this noise brush. Often when you create a terrain, it's very flat to start with. It's just it's completely empty, and so you put your stamps in, you put a cliff in, but there's still it's nice to be able to have a noise brush where I can just go run over a part of the terrain and just give it a bit of more organic feel, something that brings some life to it. So we have this noise editor, lets you either do big shapes like big waves, or smaller, finer grained shapes like sand or dirt and that kind of stuff as well. And here it is in action. So here we can put some noise down, and in this instance they're using it to kind of raise it up quite a bit. But like I said, I like it just to kind of add some texture to a ground, or add some texture to an area I'm working on as well. And we have 3 new erosion brushes, so hydraulic, thermal, and wind. And you're going to use these for different areas. So the hydraulic erosion gives these cascading sides. So it's when the water's running down something, it leaves these rivulets and brings things out. So you can see that in the cliff face there. Thermal erosion, you can think of this as when you're shaking, if you have a big pile of sand or you shake something, it all kind of falls down in a pile. And so you get various options there to how do I want my slope to what sort of slope do I want, how do I want that to form. And then wind erosion is moving things in one part of your terrain to another. So it has a direction, so I can effectively blow a wind over a terrain. It's going to pick up some sediment and it's going to push it up against a cliff, or it's going to pull apart part of a cliff and strew it across the ground. Here we can see it in this action. So the hydraulic brush, you can see we start to get effectively like water running down this cliff, and what that would look like. And thermal, this is the one that's just going to make it like a pile of sand. And wind, so here we have, you can see the sediment moving, and so you can see the wind direction there, and you can see the sediment moving, and we can push things around and change the direction, come from the other side, and start to form these sand dunes. So as I mentioned, we have this toolbox as well, which is really helping us deal with multiple terrain tiles at one time. So for instance, I worked on a project recently where I worked on a freeway project, created a 20K terrain by 5K, and I never would have been able to do this previously, or it would have been a very manual process. I can just say, hey, I've got this distance, these tiles, and even though it's this massive terrain, it was pretty easy and quick to create. I could bring in a height map, so I just went to the Australian government website, and I could download some DEM data and import it here, and then in a few steps I had recreated a part of Perth and could put a freeway down and start working with that. And this is all stuff that's new in this toolbox that I could never have done before, or would have been much more difficult to do before. So the other important aspect of it is you're usually not just working on one terrain at a time. You're going to have multiple projects going on, so you can export and import splat maps. Much more of the terrain now is an asset, so all the terrain tiles are assets, so it makes it easy to kind of save settings, save layers, save tiles, and then move them around between projects or reuse them at a later time, rather than them all existing in your scene. And you can extend that as well. So this project I just mentioned, I wrote some more tools for this toolbox as well that let me do things like assign satellite imagery and this sort of stuff as well. So here we have an example of creating a terrain. So up the top we've got the width, and we have how many tiles we'd like. So here it's going to go a 4x4 terrain. And we have this handy gizmo here as well, this blue box, which shows you the extents of the terrain. The height's actually more important than you think as well. You get to specify a height, and basically everything in your terrain is going to be scaled from 0 to 1 on that height. So you want to choose something that's not too high, so you have some, excuse me, so you have some granularity in your height, but high enough that it's going to fit in the tallest peaks of whatever terrain you're working on. And so here we can say, where do we want to save the terrain? So again, these are going to be assets that we can then source control and move between projects and this sort of stuff. And then we go and build, and there we get our terrain. So this one here has come from a height map, and it's handled, even though we reported this height map, it's handled splitting that height map over multiple terrains. There's various options for doing that, and created this multiple tile terrain for us. So I've already covered some of this. We can duplicate, we can import and export and do all these sorts of things with the terrain toolbox. If you've already got a terrain you're working with, you can go and use the terrain toolbox to split that into multiple terrains. So you don't have to start from scratch on this. You can go and come to the terrain toolbox here and say, okay, well, I've got this existing world, let's split that up. And now you can see there's 16 tiles there, 4 by 4. And start working with this. Really handy for if you want to change the shape of your terrain. If you've got an existing terrain, you can split it into tiles. And because you have the neighbouring tile option, I can then go and just create a new row of neighbouring tiles and extend my terrain in a single direction, or alternatively chop off parts of the terrain I'm not using. If I have a really large terrain and I just want to chop off one section of it, I can split into tiles and then just delete the tiles along the edge that I'm not interested in. So what else do we have here? We have a visualization tool. So this just simply shows you the height, which is useful, especially when you're making tools to say, what range am I in? What should I be choosing here? The brush mask filter is awesome. All the brushes that I have, they just apply globally. So when I'm using a brush and I'm painting away, it's just going to go everywhere on the terrain. But that's often not what you want. Sometimes I would like to say, the classic case of having snow up in the peaks, or I want to have paint a certain texture on steep slopes where the snow's fallen off. I can use these filters here to create some conditions of where the brush is going to apply, and we'll show you a little bit of that later on as well. Let's have a look at this here. So this is showing you the height data, so we can see here, okay, where the highest peaks are, and this is just helpful for you when you're developing your terrain, especially when you combine it with those masks that I just was talking about before. So for instance, if I wanted to do a snowy peak, I can say here, just want to hit those red areas, and I can get an idea about maybe where I should plug in the numbers for those filters. So we've also got a whole bunch of other brushes that you can download and use. You can make your own as well, but there was a fairly restricted number of brushes we used to have, and now there's a much larger selection. So this is showing the demo of the brush mask filter. So here I've given some examples around painting for snow and the sides of things, but you can also use it for terrain creation and modification. I can say, okay, when I'm stamping in my meshes or I'm raising and lowering my terrain, I only want it to apply above a certain level, or with other conditions, or clamp it between a certain level. Here's all the different filters you can use. So you can add something, I can negate something, so I can start taking away from a terrain. I can add noise. I can do things within a height range or a slope range, or in a concave area. Other things here, like a shortcut tool. So again, when I'm changing my brush, I don't have to go click in the editor and change which brush I'm using. I can just hit Shift A and then cycle through the brushes that are available for me. And let's see these together in action. So this is the noise editor here, and we can paint some noise on. And we can change the octaves and all this kind of stuff. There's a Perlin noise and a few different noise options you can use to get the noise that we'd like. Paint that on, and that gives, again, a more organic finish to the world. And then here we can say, okay, well, I only want that noise to apply to certain areas. And so you can see here, rather than it being a flat, I've applied that brush. it's only going to apply it to whatever rules I've set up here, which means in this case I can quickly make bulk changes over my whole terrain without having to kind of manually go in and just like paint the side of a cliff or just paint a certain area. And here's another example. So we're going to paint everything a single color. Come in here and then just paint everything within a certain height range. So I've painted the mountains in and then the ground's been left alone. And then I'm going to come in here and add another range. And choose the snow brush and then do the classic snowy peak effect here. So again, something that used to be really tedious to do before. Now with these rules we can go and, you can see in this 15-second video we've managed to color in mountains and put some snow on and have a really good base to work from, where we can add some details to. So this is where you get them. So you get the Terrain Tools package, and you go and download that, and then you go into the asset store. There is a link from the package as well called the Terrain Tools Sample Asset Pack. So a lot of people miss that. A lot of people just get the Terrain Tools package, but this is going to have a whole bunch of other brushes and textures and things that you can just work, the snow and the grass and all that sort of stuff, so you can just kind of work out of the box. And you can see it's 5-star review, including this review, which I really loved. Before I started Design Train, I didn't know about this asset. Now I'm sexy and I know it. So that could happen to you as well. All right, let me show you some of these in action. So this is the completed terrain, and my demo here is not going to look anything like this because I don't have the artistic skills. But one thing I do is one thing is interesting is compare the. This is not really terrain related, but let's go and in here. I have fog turned off in a scene view. But notice the difference here, so that's what post-processing can do for you. It's a substantial difference. One other feature that is unrelated to this talk, but I really love, is you can see I have clipping here. So especially when you're working with terrain, often you're going to go and your far clip distance is going to stop you seeing the whole thing, or you're going to come into the terrain here and you're going to have this nasty clipping down the side here that's really hard to work with. So we do now have this camera and the scene camera controls here, and so this has got dynamic clipping on, so I can just turn this off and set my clipping distances just for the scene, and so you can see now that clipping's gone, and when I go far back I'm not going to get any clipping in the distance. So when you're working on large terrains, this is definitely something you should use, because you'll run into those clipping issues as well. Okay, new scene, and so I've got the terrain asset, I've got the Terrain Tools package installed. So let me just show you that. So Terrain Tools, and obviously the links to the documentation, which are really handy, and there's a big link here to the asset on the asset store. If you forget what I told you or what the name of it was, you can just click here and it'll take you to the asset store and you can download it. I've got a few I have a few assets in here that I'll work with, but it's mostly, I'll show you here, let me zoom in, because that's going to be very hard to see. So I've got some asset store packs here, Forest House, Fantasy Environment pack, so that's going to give me some extra textures and things I can work with. But let's start from the beginning. I could, go the usual route that you've done before of going to 3D Object and creating a terrain, but what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to use the Terrain Toolbox. Let me see how visible that is for people. Good, great. So, make this bigger. So we have these 4 tabs up the top, and I've really covered most of the feature set for all of them, but we'll start with create new terrain. How big do I want it? How high do I want it? And I've mentioned that it's good to choose a range here that's as close as possible to your maximum height. And where do I want it to be? How many tiles? I'm going to create a 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre 4x4 terrain. I could here work from a height map, so here's where I'd check this on and have a height map to work with. And again, you can go find these online at most government websites. This also pairs with World Creator as well. If you have that asset, that's pretty good at creating some height maps for you as well, and also satellite imagery. And the gizmo here, so I'm going to turn this gizmo on, so we can see kind of how big our terrain is. So I'll zoom out here, so we can already get a preview of how big this is going to be. And then I'll just click Create. And it's going to go and create all these terrain tiles and just pop them in this folder here. So these are, like I mentioned, are now assets. All right, so here's our terrain, which doesn't look like anything at the moment because we haven't painted or drawn anything. Let's start sculpting and putting some stuff in there. So I'm going to move away from the terrain toolbox for a moment. I'll come back to that later on. But I'm going to click to the Inspector tab. And if I go to the terrain group, it doesn't show me anything at the moment, but I can go and select any terrain at all, and it's going to show me now the tools that we've had before, but we've now extended. So the one we're going to work with here is this Paint Terrain tool. That's where most of our new tool set is. So first thing we do here is we select what we'd like to paint. So we have the list here of, I can paint a texture, I can do my mesh stamp, I can set my height, smoothing, etc. Sculpting, the erosion effects, mesh stamping. But what I'm going to do first up is, let's just work with, let's stamp. So we have all these different brushes here. So again, some of these come from the asset store pack, so you may not get the full list if you just get the terrain tools package. But I can go and select some of these. So let's zoom in, and you can see that this is the multiple terrains working. This is going across tiles without me having to do anything. So I'm updating all these different tiles. And as I mentioned, there's the shortcuts now as well. So I can press D and rotate them, which is really nice for a situation like this, where I want to get a whole bunch of very similar meshes, but I don't want them to look really uniform. I can just go in here and start stamping them in, and then I can change the size, which makes it bigger, and the strength, which alters how high this particular one's going to be. So now I can go and, what did I do? I made that a 0 strength. So now I can go in here and start stamping this in, and before you know it, I've got some sort of terrain developing. Now I want to demonstrate the erosion brushes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and grab a more obvious block like this. I'll make it smaller and stamp that in here. So we've got this kind of very big obvious thing, but I want to show you erosion. So what I can do now is I can go and switch from the stamp to erosion, and let's start with hydraulic. And if you remember, this is the one that looks like, that's meant to simulate water pouring down and the erosion effects. So here we go. I'm going to stamp this a little bit, and it's going to go and make this kind of ravines and whatnot in my terrain. So I put those in here. I can go down to the bottom, and there's various parameters I can tweak here to get a different simulation scale I'm working on, so I get different effects. But we can see here I've got a cliff face here that has a little bit more interest in it than the usual cliff face. So that's a nice start. I can also go to thermal. This is the one that's going to make things kind of fall down like sand. So you can see that kind of cascading effect here that I've got. And again, down the bottom I have options here for do I want this to behave like ash? Do I want it to behave like mud or wet sand or soil? And that's just going to affect how quickly and how much this erodes away. And then our final erosion is wind. And so you can see now we have this big arrow on here. And so this brings me to my other shortcut key, which was D. Well, we've already used this. I can go and change the direction of the wind. So I want the wind to kind of blow across here. And as I do that, it kind of starts to move the material from this face here across the way. So we kind of see the effect of that moving things around. So we can put some stamps in, we can start to do some erosion, we can start to get interesting things happening. So I mentioned the set height tool. So here what I have is I have these peaks in here. They're probably a little bit uniform because I should have made some a bit bigger, but what I want to do is I want to get kind of a nice flat area in here rather than have, I think this is a bit high and I want to kind of make a village here maybe or something like that. So I'm going to select a terrain and I'm going to choose this set height. And so now what I can do here is I can go and control click somewhere and it's sampled the height at that position. And now when I paint, it brings everything into that height. That was a bit extreme. I don't know, maybe you want that flat, so I can still maybe choose a gentler brush and turn down the size and turn down the strength and start to just kind of massage it a little bit rather than squash everything how it was. And so I still have some of the organicness, still have some of the niceness of the terrain, but it's all still coming towards the plateau that I'm aiming for. Okay, so that's some of the tools there, and you can add your own mesh stamping, cloning, etc. that I've talked about. Let's paint some textures now. So there's been nothing on here so far. So one of the things that we're working with here is we're working with terrain layers. So at the moment I have no textures on here at all, right? We've just got this checkerboard pattern. So what I'm going to do is when I switch to paint texture, I have down the bottom here, and again please yell out if this is not visible, but I think we're okay. We have this layer palette, and at the moment this is empty, right? So I can go and add a layer, and I can just choose this grass. This is from one of the asset store packs. And it's added that layer, and at the same time, it's added, just by default, added that to the entire terrain. So this is my base layer that I'm going to paint on top of. But you will notice that it's only done it to one tile out of my entire terrain. And so this is where the terrain toolbox comes back in, because if we're working with multiple terrains, it's going to be a bit painful for me to go and set up this layer palette for each one, even though I can save it and select it. And so I could just save this as a palette and go and assign it to one of my terrains, but there's 16 tiles here, that's a bit tedious. So I'm going to go to my terrain toolbox. And we have, in the terrain utilities, we have this terrain layers section here. So I can do the same thing here. I can just add a few, I'm going to add a few layers in here. Let's just add a grass one and add another one. Say this mud. And some rocks, and that will do for now, just in the interest of time. And then I can just say add that to all the terrains. And again, it's added the first one as the default layer that I can add on top of, but it's saved me the tediousness of updating 16 terrains, 16 terrain tiles. So if I click on a random tile and I go to the inspector, I can now see that those brushes are now, those layers are now available for me for painting. So let's select the mud one. So I'll go back to this tile here, select mud, and we'll just go in and work on our village area here. So while I'm mentioning it, I'm holding shift down a lot, which I'm sure you all know for moving your camera around quickly. But again, for those who aren't aware, again, the scene camera has a camera speed here, so I can adjust this manually or use my mouse wheel as well while I'm flying around to make this quicker. Again, when you're dealing with big terrains, that's going to be really useful. So let's bring this, make this brush much smaller, and I can select the right thing. I've got paint texture, chosen the mud, and because I have my existing rule there, which I will make disappear, I can now go paint this mud in. Cool. So I'm sure that's all very familiar. I can go do all this sort of stuff. But again, we want tools to make this easier. So I'll just show you a filter for this. So let's just replicate what happened in the video there. I have these brush brush filters here. I can add one, and I have all the options that I showed you before. Let's just go with slope. So here I have the slope, so I have a strength factor of how much of this texture I would like to blend in, and I have a remap curve. So this, where on this house, for the slope steepness, how much do I want to have this, or how much do I want the strength to be? So if the slope is greater than around 0.3, it's not going to apply at all, and it's going to apply a ramp until when we have a vertical wall, it's going to apply it completely. Sorry, the other way around. This is going to apply on flat areas, but when I paint on the steep areas, it shouldn't come in. Although I've screwed something up. Remap, let's put this all the way down here. Cool. So now you can see the effect a little bit more. It's not painting on the steeper areas, but only on the ground part. And you've seen how I can do this for height as well. So I can start painting my terrain like that. I'm going to be brave and do a height one now as well. So let me get rid of the slope. Let's do the height. So we have a similar setup here where we have a height range, and we have a curve on how we would like that to apply through that height range. Now let's take a little view back here. Remember how I said we should be careful about how high we make the terrain? Because we've said the terrain's going to be up to 500 meters high, right? And what I've actually got is I've got these tiny little hills down here, and I could have a maximum height here. And this can be potentially confusing because when we look at the height range is from 0 to 1 and normalized across the whole box that I've showed you there. So I've actually got this kind of tiny little mountains down here with this potentially huge box. So I've kind of chosen a bad terrain height. I could bring that down. I can use my terrain utilities even to bring that back down and fix that up. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to choose a small height range. So I'm just going to say from 0 to maybe like 0.1. And when we come in and look at this, and we have a brush, it will show us when this will apply. So we can see as I move up the side of the hill, can we see the orange that happens there? So that's going to have full strength. Let me choose a different, let me add a snow layer here to make this really obvious. So I've got snow here, and I have no snow down here, which is interesting because it was 0 to 0.1. There. So let me come in here, and I'm going to change my let's make this smaller. Right. Okay. So, all right. So let's go 0.05 to 1. So we have snow at the top, and we shouldn't have snow on the ground. Okay. I'm not going to belabor this one, but we have these rules that work. You can trust me, but not working for me right now in the live demo. That's the way it goes. So we have these rules. You can use different layers. And then the final thing, and this really hasn't changed at all, is adding trees and details as well. So this is really the same as before. I can come into the tree section. I can click Edit Tree, and I can add a tree in. I think some things to be aware of for this are, this is using the universal render pipeline. And so you're going to have your usual material conversion process when you use this. I've found when I'm working with terrains, a lot of the trees are still, they're either used in Unity's inbuilt tree editor, which is used less and less, or they're using speed tree. The universal render pipeline now has a shader for speed tree. So you can convert those. Before you couldn't convert those, and so you'd get pink trees. There's no shader for our inbuilt tree system, and there won't be. So I think that's it's been used less and less. People are using SpeedTree. Most people use SpeedTree all the time. So we've supported SpeedTree in this instance. Let me go and find a tree. So we have the forest house environment here. I go to prefab, and let's just choose a tree from here. And if I jumped into this tree here, you would see, let me show you actually. I'll just jump into the prefab editor. And if we look at the lot of this tree here, let me zoom in so you can all see this clearly. It's using the Universal Render Pipeline Nature SpeedTree 8 shader. So just to show the support for SpeedTree now. But when you go to the asset store and you download a tree pack, most likely they're not using this particular shader, and you will have to go and manually say, okay, instead of using this old SpeedTree shader, I want to use this SpeedTree shader instead, and it'll all work. But just be aware of that. We've got pink trees. That's what you need to check out. Yep, so this is the same as before. I can get my trees. I didn't actually add that tree, which was silly of me. So let's drag this tree in. Add. And I've got all those various options for density. I'll bring the density down because it's quite high by default. Put some trees in. This one's nice. I can go and make these trees are kind of large, so I might undo that. Make them smaller, but then I've got like a random range I can choose for how big I want these trees, so I get some variety. And there we go, sprinkle these trees around. And then the next section is going to be the details, so I can add detail objects here. I'll just quickly do this for you. So I can add a texture that just has some transparency, and it's going to create a billboard for me. So this is really good for grass and other details that you have around the place. So let me throw this grass texture in, and then click Add. And when I come in here, so it loads out at a certain distance. When I come in here, I can just paint this grass in. It's not the most aesthetically awesome example, but you can see the result here of being able to just quickly and easily paint in details, small details that are billboarded. So there we go. That's really it. The only thing I haven't really shown you that I talked about was the heat map for showing how big something is, which is not doing its thing. And we have various settings here for what we want trees for, how we'd like the wind to behave, which again we can apply to all terrain tiles at once, which is really useful. And we can export splat maps and use them on our other terrains once we've got the nice splat maps we've created that we want to reuse. So what's coming up next? So we're going to bring in terrain holes. So you'll be able to go and poke a hole through your terrain. And again, it's just using a brush. And it's just going to pop a hole in for you. And that's going to come, although that's in the interface at the moment, that's really going to be properly here in 2019.3. And that will interact probably with lighting and physics and detail maps and all that sort of stuff as well. So 2019.3, we'll have a new terrain tools update, hole painting, as we've mentioned before, and you'll be able to export your terrain height maps at a higher precision than you can at the moment. So if you want to learn more, here's some great resources and YouTube channels to check out. And probably the best thing to do is play around, but you can see brackies do a speed paint, for instance, or various things going on. So and there's a GitHub, our GitHub as well down the bottom here for getting some more samples and brushes, and especially if you're interested in extending the terrain, that's a really great thing to grab because there's some code samples there for brushes and this sort of stuff as well. Great. That's it. Thank you very much.